Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of RPGs with Paddy. I'm Paddy. Sorry for the delay in putting these ones out, but we got pretty heavy snow all of a sudden, and shoveling that took up a lot of extra time. This is the Numenera video, because it required the most background reading of the three. Trail of Cthulhu and RuneQuest will be coming out tomorrow before I move on. That's Friday. Before I move on to the last entry for all of these over the weekend. So we're into the last week, the last two entries of New Game Master Month, and let's see what we need for Numenera. So in this generic part, all you have to do is gather a few things. So the list here is dice for your system. What do we need for Numenera? Well, mostly we need D20s, so pick up a few of these if you can, but you can get by even with just one. That should cover pretty much everything, but there are some rare cases in Numenera where you might need a D6, so just normal 6-sided dice, or percentile dice, so 2 D10s, and then you can add it up. The first one will be the tens dice, and the other one will be the units. So if you roll a 9 and a 4, that's going to be 94 to get you a number from from 1 to 100. So if you have those, great. If you don't worry about it. You can kind of get by without it, or you can use an online roller. The next thing is some paper and a pencil, just so you can take notes, so you can make a map. Blank character sheets are, of course, important. These are available on page 411 of the Numenera Discovery Core Book. I would say print out as many sheets as you have players and a few extra ones. They usually get messed up or something goes wrong. It's always nice to have a few extra ones handy. And then finally, drinks and snacks. These are absolutely not necessary, but it's kind of a bit of a tradition, and it's always fun, and it can really help increase player enjoyment as they learn the new system. So learning a new system can be a little bit difficult or complex, or just takes brain power, and so if you're doing it while eating snacks, it just makes it a little bit easier. So they also recommend or suggest that you could have additional copies of the core book, but it's absolutely not necessary. In the future, if you and your group are going to be playing Numenera a lot more, then it's great if some of the other players can buy their own copies rather than you supplying them. So other completely optional things are any handouts that you've prepared. There's none in the pre-written adventure, but if you've made maps or clues or anything like that, just have them ready. If you don't have anything, that's fine. A GM screen. So this keeps your notes secret from the players and also has useful tables and rules, reminders that only you can see. I don't think you need this for your first game, the Taker of Sorrows, but if you want, there is a Numenera specific one. So it's only available in PDF from the Monty Cook website, and you can see a couple of images of it here. But there are some better images, and the physical version you can order on Drive-Thru RPG. So basically what you'll see is that there's very beautiful artwork on the outside, and on the inside there are some useful tables. If you click on full size preview, you can actually get a better look at this. So here we've got some beautiful artwork. This will face the players, and then on the inside you'll get these useful tables. Numenera doesn't have that many rules, so you can keep this, or you can, you can use this, or you can do without it. Is fine. But for example, here you've got the list of task difficulties written for you there. Bits about armor and damage and distance, special rolls. This one in particular, so if you order the premium or the premium, well, obviously there's no extra cost, so you should order the premium one plus the PDF if you're going to get it. Basically it's a changeable insert one, so like kind of plastic files, I guess, and you can put it in and remove this. So you could use it for this game, you could use it for other game systems, or you can easily add your own notes into it as well. You could also use a vinyl mat and some wet erase markers. I was using this a little bit with a D&D game before COVID, but since then I haven't used it. And similarly with miniatures, I don't use them. I think that theater of the mind, so kind of imagining everything, is easier and less distracting. But if you want to use maps and or miniatures, yeah, please, of course, play the way that you want. Tokens, some games like Conan 2D20 or Octung Cthulhu, again 2D20, both from Modiphius, need coins or markers to track momentum. In Numenera, you can use it to denote XP, just something you can physically give to the players to be like, here's 2 XP for my GM intrusion. It's absolutely not necessary though, as the character sheet has an entry for it. But if you want, you can use it. And other games, game accessories. Player aids might be helpful, but I don't think there's anything they need to have on hand for the Taker of Sorrows. So now, moving on to the specific system part, we have a little bit of a little bit more than a little bit of reading to do. So let's check it out over in the PDF. So here we are in chapter 20, and this gives good advice to the GM. So I would advise you read through it all, but I'll give you a quick overview. You don't need to read through all of this before your first game by any means. So if it's a little bit too much for you, yeah, you can come back another time, or not at all if you don't want. But there are some nice nuggets here. But again, I'll just give you this quick overview. So the rules of Numenera are meant to be simple and make being a GM straightforward enough. Try to focus on the story and don't worry so much about the rules. There will not be a specific rule for every possible outcome. Rather, the framework is there, the difficulty rating is there, and just do your best to rule it. The story from the Taker of Sorrow has already been created for you. If the players try something, you can think about the difficulty chart, and that's about it. So try to make sure that all of the players get a chance to shine. In particular, the players can take any flavor of action that they want. Even in combat, one player could decide to do an uppercut for their fist attack, and another player decides to do a roundhouse punch. There's no specific rules for this because difficulty-wise, they're the same, fist attack. But this allows the player to describe their actions uniquely, be more creative, and focus on the narrative more than the mechanics. So the biggest task for you will be setting the difficulty rating, apart from describing the narrative, which is the most important. But when it comes to mechanics, it's setting the difficulty rating. But it's really straightforward enough, and just use your best judgment. There's no right or wrong answer. Just look at this table, and if you have the GM screen, it'll be there as well. And so look at this as often as you need to. The more experienced you are with Numenera, the easier it will be to judge what level a certain task is. And it just comes from practice. But I really liked this section here as a great explanation for difficulty rating. With that in mind, think about the active balance. With enough focus, most people can walk across a narrow bridge, like a fallen tree trunk. That suggests that it is difficulty 2. So let's just look. Difficulty 2. Typical task requiring focus, but most people can usually do this. Great. However, walking across a narrow plank that's only 3 inches wide, that's probably more like difficulty 3. Requires full attention. Most people have a 50-50 chance to succeed. And you're like, yeah, I can imagine that, all right. Now, consider walking across a tightrope. That's probably difficulty 5. A normal person can manage that only with a great deal of luck. Someone with training can give it a go, but it's still hard. Of course, a professional acrobat can do it easily. So, number 5 here. Even trained people often fail. That's not specialized. So if someone was specialized in it, they would be able to reduce the value down. But just remember, when you're setting the difficulty, you do not take the character into account. Set it at the difficulty regardless of all your players, and then their skills and effort and anything else can reduce the difficulty. But again, don't worry about it too much. There is a note here on consistency. So once you've established a task difficulty, the same task should always be that difficulty. That consistency is important. It helps players understand the world. So the ninth world is new to them. They don't know how things work. And by giving them that consistency, they start to understand the world better, and they understand what their characters are capable of as well. However, this is also followed up by an important note saying, don't worry if you make a mistake. There's no such thing as a real mistake. But most of the time, the players won't even know. Or you can explain that a previous door was easier to knock down because it had a structural flaw or it was damaged recently. The goal is to make a relatively quick assessment of the difficulty and move on with the game. If it's something mechanical that's going to come up many times and you realize that you've made it too easy or too difficult, between sessions or in a break, just tell your players, hey, I misjudged this. It's going to be difficulty X going forward. I think as long as you're clear with them and not constantly changing back and forth, it should be fine. Remind your players again that this is not a player, and remind yourself as well, this is not a player versus GM kind of game, and I think most role-playing games aren't. You, as the GM, are there to provide an interesting narrative framework for your players. If everything is too easy, or if everything is too hard, it's not interesting. So there's another point here as well. Oh, there's consistency, sorry. And there's mistakes. I'm a little bit behind on my scrolling. There is another point here, which is important though. Don't ask for rolls for every little thing. Players should only roll when it's interesting or exciting. There's a chance of success or failure, and they will both kind of lead to interesting outcomes. Otherwise, just let the players do what they said. This keeps the game flowing. This keeps the game flowing narratively and avoids too many mechanics and too much rolling. Lets them just focus on the game. They give an example of tying a... They give an example of tying a rope to a rock to climb down a cliff. If it's just getting from A to B, you can just have the player do it and ask them for a brief description of how they do it. You don't need them to make a rope tying roll and then a climb roll. If you think it might be interesting for the rope to come undone while they're climbing, that's what the GM intrusions are for. So here we get another system for calculating difficulty, but personally I'm not so fond of that. Feel free to read it if you want, but to avoid any confusion, especially for your first game, I'll be skipping it in this, and I would probably recommend you skip it until you've run a few games. Next we talk a little bit more about GM intrusions. And of course this is a great way, this is your big chance to add drama and excitement to the game. And again, I'll just remind you, and you should, acknowledge to your players as well, this is not about the GM versus the players. You don't want to beat the players. It's about creating an interesting and dramatic narrative. So when you're doing a GM intrusion, you're doing it to make the situation more interesting or more dramatic. You're not trying to catch them out or, oh, you didn't do this, so I'm going to do this. It's just about adding a little bit of drama and excitement into it. So we get some examples of how you can use GM intrusions as a narrative tool. So we get some examples of how you can use GM intrusions as a narrative tool and as a resolution mechanic. These are good reads you should go through for general gaming in Numenera. But again, I wouldn't worry about them too much in your first game. Basically, we can use GM intrusions to kind of gently guide the story in a certain direction without railroading them. without railroading the players. Or we can use GM intrusions to provide drama and challenges for the players, and to determine certain things without leaving it completely to random choice. So after that, there is a list of some different sample GM intrusions, and it's split into different categories. So we've got some for if it's just bad luck, if there's an unexpected or impending complication, the opponent gets lucky, there's some fumbles, and there's also partial successes. So you do what you tried to do, but something bad came from it as well. Or you did what you tried to do, but not as well as you wanted to. So next we get a discussion on how to adjudicate. And this is a really good read overall again. Everything here is really, really interesting and very well written. But I think that this is more helpful after your first session. Don't get too hung up on it. And I would say read it after your session, after your first session, just as a bit of reflection. Because a lot of this might not mean so much to you before your first session. So run your first session, and then you can look back on this as a reflection and think, oh, do I want to add that into my next game? But I think, reading it now might just be a little bit overwhelming and confusing, really. The next paragraph talks about logic, and it can be streamlined down to these 2 sentences in bold. I'll also read the lead-in paragraph for context. Running a game requires a lot of logic rather than a careful reading of the rules. For example, some things give characters a resistance to fire, but there is no special rule for fire damage as opposed to slicing damage or lightning damage. Instead, you use logic to determine whether the damage inflicted counts as fire. In these situations, there are only 2 times when your answer is wrong. The first is when the answer breaks the player's suspension of disbelief. So, for example, something that makes a PC fire resistant should probably provide some protection against a heat-based weapon. If it doesn't, your answer will spoil the moment for the group. And the second wrong answer is when you're inconsistent. If you allow the fireproof armor a PC wears to give some protection against lava one time, but not the next, that's a problem. Not only because it breaks a suspension of disbelief, but also because it gives the players nothing to base their decisions on. Without predictable consistency, they can't make intelligent decisions. So this is similar to what I spoke about above. In general, you want to keep that consistency going from round to round. Now, if you decide you've made a ruling and, it's game breaking, or you're like, this is really unbalanced or something like that, of course, you can keep playing with that, and, it's fine. Sometimes it's fine for the players to be a little bit more powerful than expected. And actually, a little bit later in this discussion, they talk about that. But also, you can just have a little discussion with your players. Once they understand, oh, it was a slip-up, okay, that's fine. The rule is different. Don't just have it one way, one difficulty level, or one, it works one way, one time, and then change it the next time without telling the players. If you do that by mistake and the players bring up, oh, it worked this way last time, then it's probably best to, revert to what you did, and you can deal with that after the session. Okay, this time we're going to do this, but then after the session we're going to talk, and going forward it's going to be this. Something like that is my recommendation on that. In general, I think players are pretty cool. Don't worry about giving them something too powerful. I think that's fine in Numenera anyway. So here there is a section about rolling dice and when to know when to roll. Again, I wouldn't worry about it too much, but it's a good guideline. The 2 things that I would keep in mind here are the highlighted parts. First, don't ask for a roll unless it seems like there should be a chance of failure and a chance of success. If it's a definite impossibility, don't have them roll. Just say, no, it can't be done. But if it's definitely going to work, say, it works. And the second thing, if a creature, so a PC player character, or NPC non-player character, or the object is affected in a harmful way, or in the case of a creature, in a way that they don't want to be affected, harmful or not, you need to involve a die roll. So the wording is a little bit strange there, but basically if one character is acting upon another character or another object in a way that they don't want or in a negative way to them, there should be a dice roll as well. You can't just negatively affect someone without a dice roll. As to how much information you should give to the players, we get a worked example here, which I encourage you to look at if you're feeling uncertain about how can I give the information to the players. There's a bit more, but again, if you feel confident or you feel like you can do it, or at least you want to try, no problem. Anyway. So there's a bit more information here about partial successes or graduated successes. This is an optional additional rule that comes up only in specific situations where a task could, for example, be completed perfectly at difficulty level 5 and partially at difficulty level 3. This is also the case where there are a number of different outcomes. But again, just being aware that you're free to do this in the games is all you need to know. I don't think there's any need for it in the Taker of Sorrow. Although if the players are trying to fix the machine, they might get a perfect success at one difficulty level and a partial success at a lower level. So for example, if the difficulty level you set was, let's say, 5 to repair the machine, then if they manage to do that, they manage to get the 15, or even if they reduced it, then it works perfectly and it's back to its original purpose and people can be restored. But if they roll a lower level of success, so they only roll like a 9 or something like that, they could have something like, it works, but it looks like it's got a limited number of charges or something like that. Or it works half of the time. So getting the teratomas back in to turn them back into humans, it works sometimes, but other times maybe they die or something like that. That's just off the top of my head anyway. So there is a section here about character abilities, and it just says basically the real secret here, just between me and you. The game, it's not about tiers, it's not about types or any of that stuff. That is the key to really understanding the system. It's the ciphers. So we're going to talk about ciphers a little bit later, but just before that, I want to draw your attention to, we'll skip optional rules. You know, we don't need optional rules yet. But here is a nice paragraph or pop-out box that I do think is good for you to read. How to encourage player creativity. This is important for any role-playing game, and it's always a tough point for new GMs, but also with new players. Often players have difficulty knowing what they can do in games, and in Numenera the options aren't spelled out as much. They're kind of free to interpret it however they want. Therefore, you should always leave options open to their ideas. Now, that said, remember, you don't have to just let them succeed in everything that they do. An example I always give is if they try to convince the king to give up the kingdom. No, you can't even roll on that. That's not going to happen. But in general, if they're making a logical, reasonable, creative attempt, you should definitely encourage that and let them try it anyway. This paragraph or this section also says that there should be 2 or more solutions to every problem. The straightforward one, which is the obvious one, and the not so straightforward one. As the GM, you don't have to come up with these solutions, but you should be willing to go along with the player's ideas if it makes any kind of sense. So now on to ciphers. Players will probably think of ciphers as equipment or treasure, but the GM, it says here, should think of them as character abilities. So this is a new ability that a temporary ability or a once-off ability that the characters have. And they can be found in many, many ways through exploring or digging around, etc. Or they can also be given as a reward by grateful NPCs. So they say here, and I'll just read it right from here. As a rule of thumb, in any given adventure, a character should use at least as many ciphers as they can carry. This means they should find that number of ciphers in the same amount of time, give or take. Again, this is a rule of thumb. You don't have to do it. Thus, you can simply add up the number of ciphers the PCs can carry, and on average, they should find at least that many ciphers in a given adventure. The next thing is there are also two kinds of ciphers. Something that makes you better at something you can already do, or something that allows you to do something new. And remember, ciphers are single-use items, so you should be able to find new ones relatively easily. There's also a couple of bullet points here about what you should think about when you're making ciphers. They should be powerful. It's not really worth it if they just have a minor effect. Ciphers shouldn't have drawbacks. And they should have a temporary, not a permanent effect, and they can really take any form. So characters start, this part is not here, this is going back through the other information. Characters start with a certain number of ciphers equal to their limit. So for glaives and jacks, they have a cipher at tier 1. They have a cipher limit of 2, and their starting equipment also includes 2 ciphers. For nanos, they start off with 3, and that's their limit at this level. Once you go above your limit, it risks something bad happening. And that's listed in the cipher chapter, which we might go into in the next section, or you can just look at yourself. Anyway, so in the Taker of Sorrow, we should give the players at the starting equipment some ciphers that they might want to naturally use in early scenarios. So for me, I was thinking about the Murden encounter, the farmyard, things like that. Think, what kind of ciphers would be useful for them there? And then after they use it, or even if they don't use it, you can give them some reward from that encounter. The farmers might be grateful for clearing out the farm, saving the farm, and give them a cipher, or there might be one kind of half hidden under the farm as they're looking at it there. The Murden might offer a trade for a specific cipher, because she, I think it's a she anyway, really wants to get treasures, and maybe she sees something really good, and she's like, ooh, I want that, and I'll give you this in exchange. So these extra rewards, maybe they'll be useful later on in the Taker of Sorrow, or maybe they'll be useful in future sessions as well. But the idea is that you should encourage the players to use the ciphers often, and also that they'll find more pretty regularly. And you don't really want to just be kind of wasting those ciphers that you have, because you're limited in how many you can carry safely. Artifacts can usually be used more often than ciphers, or more times than ciphers, but they always have a depletion roll. I don't think we've gone through this yet, but every time you use it, it could be its last time. It's a way for the GM to change how players interact with the world, because now the players with an artifact have a new ability. If you want this to only be kind of like a rare change to the player's interaction, then the depletion roll, the chance of it being destroyed, you could use a 1d6. So every time they use it, they roll a 1d6, and if it's a 1, then it will be destroyed or out of charges. If you want it to be something that the players use a lot to interact with the world, or can use a lot, then you can make the depletion roll 1 in D100. So they've got only a 1% chance every time that they use it that it will be its last time. So the next subsection tells us to allow characters to create their own skills. So, there's not a specific list of skills. And we should be relatively accommodating when it comes to that. But do remind the players that having a skill such as doing things, which would apply to everything, is not in the spirit of the game, and we'll rule that out. So there is a nice part here about fleshing out your NPCs to make them realistic. They're not just there for the players to interact with. They have their own lives and their own motivations. So they won't just be easily fooled, or as I mentioned above, a king won't just give up his kingdom. If you need help, bringing them to life, base them on real people that you know or characters in books or movies. That will make them easier for you to roleplay and more fun for the players to interact with, and they will remember them more. We also get a little bit here on creating NPC stats. Generally, they'll just be at a certain level for everything, but you can kind of alter it to your liking. But again, we don't need that now for our first session. When it comes to death, or when NPCs reach 0 health, they are down. But that could mean dead or unconscious or incapacitated. So just read the scene and what is logical in that situation to decide what down, what 0 health means. For interactions between players and NPCs, player characters and NPCs, you can choose to include a dice roll in their interaction or forego it in any given situation. Again, you will judge it based on the logic. If it's just a normal interaction between friends, then, probably no roll is needed. But if the player character is trying to persuade or threaten or deceive the NPC, then probably a roll will be involved. You should also think about how the NPC views the player in question, even if it's just they're a stranger. There's a little point here about language. Generally, there are different languages here, and I think the truth is the most widespread language. But in general, in these games, language is not included as a barrier because it can just kind of slow down and almost halt role playing. But of course, you can play it however you want. I think that including languages can add to some nice role-playing instances as well, but in general it's just a little bit more hassle than it's worth in my experience. So the next section discusses how to handle different types of creatures, but again, a lot of it just kind of comes down to logic. If it's a faster, more agile creature, you should make it harder to hit. If it's a larger, slower creature, make it easier to hit. As there is no creature creation system in Numenera, you can feel free to do it however you want. As long as it makes for an interesting or a dramatic encounter, it should be good. The penultimate part of this chapter is about character customization options. I would definitely avoid using this in your first game. It adds unnecessary complications to the game for both the players and the GM, and it will more than likely slow the game and the character creation way down. After your first game, or a few games, read through this and see if you want to include some or all of it. They can be pretty interesting, all right? And then after that, you can discuss it with the players and say, hey, you can avail of these or something like that. The last part of the chapter details the different tiers. Our first adventure is set only in tier 1, so we don't really need to read it just yet, but you can have a quick look at that if you want. Okay, so the second part of our reading homework, and this is a much shorter section, don't worry, is about building a story. But for teaching new players, which is presumably what you'll be doing, especially as we're all learning the session now, and then we have to kind of explain it. I said session, I meant system. Then we have to explain it to our players, kind of like concisely enough and in a nice enough light that they want to play it. This whole mini section here is great, so I'm just going to read through that for you. Teaching the rules. It's not really your job to teach the players the rules, yet it often falls upon the GM to do just that. Before beginning a game, encourage the players to read Chapter 2, How to Play Numenera, to get an overview of the game. It won't take them that long. It won't take them long. Yeah, and we did that during this course, and Chapter 2 is nice and straightforward. Gives you the overview, kind of, even if they don't fully understand everything, if they've just kind of read it, then when you're explaining the rules or when you're giving a ruling, they'll be like, okay, yeah, I kind of get it. You'll probably also want to give them an overview of the setting. Chapter 1, Welcome to the Ninth World, is designed just for this purpose. Focus primarily on the kinds of characters a player can create and what they might do in the game. So for character creation, we're actually going to be looking at that in the final session. So don't worry too much if you don't know now. Once players understand who they are and what they'll do, the rest of the setting is just details they can discover as they go along. The key to teaching someone the game is to start with the idea of the dice rolls and how they use the same mechanic no matter what a character tries to do. So that is one of the great points about Numenera, is that it has this very, very simple system. Anything you're trying to do, if it requires a roll, the game master will just think about the difficulty level, and that's what number you need to roll. Then you can use your creativity about your character to say, oh, I think I can reduce it to this. Something like that. So then explain using effort, which involves an introduction to the 3 stats. After that, a player is ready to start making a character. Taking a new player through the character creation process gets them ready to play. Don't overload them with a lot of details beyond that. All of those can be picked up as needed in the course of play. As the GM, we kind of have to know, most of the rules. We haven't done all of them, but most of them. But the players don't need to know those, certainly not at the start. As the game goes on and as you come across the different rules, that's when you kind of explain them bit by bit to the player so as not to overload them. So when it comes to running combat in Numenera, long is not generally good. You don't want it to drag out too long. And also, if the players find creative ways to kind of get around combat or to avoid it, you should always allow and encourage that if it makes sense. And adventures don't need to end with a showdown against a big boss. Remember, and remind your players, that the game is primarily about discovery and experimentation. Now, there is a nice little section here about a way to combine combat and discovery. So the creature attacks, but during the fight, it telepathically says things like curious and creature unknown and protect the sanctum. It's telepathically talking to someone else, but the PCs overhear. Although the combat is fairly standard, the PCs have discovered a new creature and they know it's something that's never encountered a human before. There are more of them somewhere, and there's some kind of sanctum. It's not just a fight. The PCs have learned something. I think that is great, and even just looking at that, it kind of sparks the creativity, both as a GM, what you're going to do with that, and as a PC, you want to find out more about that. So the next section is about crafting stories. For this, you're running a pre-written adventure, but you can still present it in an interesting way. The most important thing is to know what motivates your players and also their characters. What is interesting for your players to play through, and what are the backgrounds and the motives of their characters as well. So present your players and their characters with something that piques their interest. Involve the player characters directly if possible. I'm not sure if that works in A Taker of Sorrow, unless a relation of theirs is from this town where things are going wrong. Also, I'll always allow the decisions of the players to affect the story and its outcomes. So there is more here too, but it's mostly for when you're writing your own adventure, so come back to it after you've run Taker of Sorrows. However, I can't skip over pacing. So there's different sections on pacing. During an encounter, don't let the action get bogged down. Make quick rulings, and as the result of the encounter becomes clear, it doesn't need to be dragged out to its very final point. So if the players are clearly going to win the combat, you don't have to wait until they actually get the health all the way down to zero. Equally, encourage your players not to bring up distracting things that are not related to the game, as it really does ruin the immersion and the flow of the game. During the entire game session, you'll have to figure out how many encounters to have and what types of encounters, so long or short, easy or complex, etc. If there's an interesting reason for playing out the scene, of course, do that and possibly include roles. If it's something simple, you can kind of just hand wave it and say, yes, you did that. The example that they give here is going shopping in a town. If the player wants to interact with the merchants, or if there is some information they might find there, let them role play that out. If they just want to buy a new tunic and there's nothing of interest in the shops and they don't really want to talk to anyone, you can just say, oh, you bought a new tunic for this amount of money. Done. That kind of like skips over something that they're not really into, and you can move on to the next session, moving the story forward as well. If players are getting really bogged down and progressing things very slowly, this often happens with first-time gamer groups. They have trouble deciding what to do, and either no one wants to take the lead and say, hey, we're doing this, or too many people want to take the lead and no one can agree on it. When that happens, just urge them to kind of move things along. Hey, let's move on with the story. What are you doing next? And in the Taker of Sorrow, I have forgotten the name now. Sorry, it's a little bit late and I'm sleepy. But the NPC that you're traveling with can kind of help guide them in this session as well. As they get more experience with it, it probably won't be so much of an issue. The book also recommends keeping a clock handy, so you can keep an eye on the time and keep an eye on your target finishing time. Running a little bit over time is usually fine, and it happens a lot, but often games run an hour or more over the intended end. This makes it less likely for people to come back if you needed that deadline. If you have to end mid adventure, it's really, really good to end on a cliffhanger. Even if you end up finishing it a little bit earlier than expected, finishing on a cliffhanger is a great way to leave the session, and it makes the players hungry for more. They want to find out what's going to happen. So there's a little bit here on describing items and giving precise details or comparisons. Initially, I thought you can just ignore this or use it as you like, but actually, on reflection, I think it's great practical advice and will really help to create better worlds. So it says don't use things like big or small, but when you're describing the height of a structure, you don't have to say it's 342 meters tall. But if you describe a building as, instead of a tall tower, say a tower at least 5 times the height of the trees around it. That small change, because, effectively it's saying the same information, but that small change really does, make a difference in how the players imagine it and how immersive your world is. So I will be more mindful of doing this in all the RPGs that I play from now on. In action, combat and otherwise, encourage the players to describe what they're doing and encourage them to be creative in doing so. It doesn't matter what the mechanics say. What are you doing? How are you doing it? Their description doesn't have to be long, and usually it's best if it's not long, but it really adds a bit of flavor and again helps the players get immersed in the action if they are describing unique way what they are doing. So now, because the ninth world is almost completely alien to us, describing things in the ninth world in relation to our current time might color your player's image of the thing incorrectly. The items involved are very removed from what we can imagine here, so try to describe it without comparison to our time as much as possible. So there is a list of kind of like general suggestions what you should do here. So say slug spitter and needlers, but not guns. Say machine intelligence before artificial intelligence. Never say AI or computer. But again, I wouldn't worry about it too much, especially in your first game. And the next part is great. These description ideas paint a very interesting world that I want to explore and find out more about. So I'll just choose a few random ones there. Giant gleaming insects glide about on multiple pairs of wings. Flowering plants seem to sing or moan. Odd patches of violet fungus grow everywhere. The voice of an NPC does not match the movements of her mouth. And that is all she wrote for this session. There was a lot of reading there. And most of it is very useful, but not all of it applies to running your first game. My biggest piece of advice to you is not to worry about this, especially if this is your first time being a GM for any role-playing game. If you're reading through this and it's a bit overwhelming, put it down. You can return to it any time in the future, after one game, after 10 games, or never. These are only guidelines and suggestions. You'll find what works best for you and your group with or without these suggestions. There's certainly very nice ideas in here, but don't feel like you have to read through this in great detail. Take from it anything you want and leave the rest. And what you want from it may even change over time. Okay, so we're almost ready for the final session. It's actually up at the time of recording this. Sorry for being late. So I will try to get that out to you soon. In it, we'll be learning more about the characters Jack, Glaive, and Nano. Okay, that's all for now, and I will see you next time. Bye.